But I go, can I just try another one? That moment comes and I just go, this is Sparta!
Gerard Butler stood on a blue screen stage in Montreal, wearing little more than a leather cape and a battle-worn expression, and roared a line that would echo through pop culture for the next 2 decades. This is Sparta became one of the most recognizable moments in modern cinema history. But what most fans sitting in those darkened theaters never realized was just how much pain, sacrifice, and near-physical breakdown went into creating those 2 hours of slow-motion glory. Years after the camera stopped rolling, Butler has finally started pulling back the curtain, and the story he tells is far more brutal, far more fascinating, and far more human than anything shown on screen. When Zack Snyder's 300 opened in theaters in March 2007, nobody in Hollywood was betting big on it. The film had no massive star power in the traditional sense, no sweeping location shoots in ancient landscapes, and no conventional war epic formula to fall back on. What it had was a bold visual vision, a graphic novel as its blueprint, and a cast of actors who were about to put their bodies through something most people would consider closer to actual military training than film preparation. The industry expected modest returns from a niche project with a modest $60 million budget. What happened instead was that opening weekend pulled in $70 million alone, stunning studio executives and critics alike. By the time its theatrical run ended, the film had crossed $450 million worldwide, cementing itself as one of the most unexpected commercial triumphs of the decade. But numbers only tell half the story. The real story was happening behind the camera, in the sweat-drenched training rooms, the overheated studio sets, and emergency rooms that saw the cast more often than anyone would care to admit. Long before a single frame was shot, Gerard Butler had already begun his transformation into King Leonidas. And transformation is not a word being used loosely here. Butler underwent 7 full months of physical preparation that redefined the outer limits of what he believed his body could endure. He trained up to 6 hours every single day under the guidance of elite fitness coach Mark Twight at a facility called Jim Jones. The program blended CrossFit methodology with heavy strength training, combat drills, martial arts conditioning, and endurance circuits that pushed participants past the point of comfort and deep into territory most professional athletes rarely visit. There were no light days, no recovery weeks built into the early schedule, and absolutely no shortcuts permitted. Every actor in the ensemble was subjected to the same unforgiving regimen, and the goal was not simply to look like warriors on camera. The goal was to move like them, breathe like them, and feel the weight of physical excellence with every step taken across that stage. What made the preparation especially grueling was that it never actually stopped. Even once filming began, the cast continued working out between takes, using spare moments on set to maintain the muscular definition that Snyder's hyper-stylized camera demanded. Cameras shooting in slow motion are unforgiving instruments. Every muscle, every tendon, every bead of sweat is visible in a way that standard filming speeds conceal. There was no room for a cast member to ease off and hope that clever camera angles would do the rest. The work had to be real, and Butler, more than anyone, knew that because he was the face of the entire production. He later admitted in interviews that the training was, in his words, destroying his body. He developed tendinitis that made movement agonizing. He sustained hip damage that lingered long after production wrapped. He tore his rotator cuff so severely that at certain points during filming, he could barely raise his arms above shoulder height. And yet he kept going, driven by something that went beyond professional obligation and entered the territory of personal obsession with embodying a character he deeply believed in. The physical toll did not end with injuries suffered during training. On the actual set of 300, the environment itself became a source of constant physical punishment. Snyder built the world of ancient Sparta inside a studio in Montreal, using an almost entirely digital backlit approach. Roughly 90% of what audiences see on screen was constructed through visual effects in post-production. The cliffs of Thermopylae, the vast Persian armies, the crashing waves, the atmospheric skies, all was created digitally. What the actors were working within was a large, hot, artificially lit studio space, surrounded by blue screens and sparse physical props. The lighting setup required to achieve the film's signature high contrast, golden tone visual style generated intense heat. Cast members were performing in this sweltering environment while dressed in leather, metal, and armor pieces that absorbed and radiated that heat back onto their bodies. Butler later revealed that during one particularly demanding stretch of shooting, the combination of physical exhaustion, dehydration, and the punishing heat of the studio lights caused him to pass out on set. That was not a dramatic exaggeration for an interview. That was simply the reality of what the production demanded. Injuries became a daily feature of life on set that the cast almost began to normalize. Butler has spoken candidly about how it became routine to turn around mid-scene and find a fellow actor on the ground, taken out by some physical mishap during a fight sequence. A spear came dangerously close to piercing one actor's eye. Another cast member fractured his ankle after a mistimed fall during combat choreography. These incidents were not isolated accidents caused by carelessness. They were the predictable result of asking human beings to perform complex, high-impact physical sequences repeatedly in tight spaces, wearing restrictive gear, often without the full protection that relying on stunt doubles would have provided. Snyder made a conscious creative decision to have the actors perform as much of their own action as possible, believing rightly that the resulting footage would carry an authenticity that no amount of clever editing could fully replicate. It worked brilliantly on screen. It cost the cast significantly in flesh and bone behind it. What separated Butler from simply being a very fit actor playing a warrior was the psychological depth he brought to the role alongside the physical commitment. He has spoken in interviews about approaching Leonidas not as a character to be studied intellectually, but as a state of mind to be inhabited. He meditated regularly during production, describing his practice as an attempt to channel the spirit of a man who could look at certain death, gather 300 soldiers around him, and choose to walk forward anyway. This might sound like the kind of mystical language actors sometimes reach for in press junkets, but Butler's account of it carries genuine weight when you consider that the performance itself reflects something beyond mere technical skill. There is a quality in the portrayal of Leonidas that feels less performed and more possessed. The meditation was his way of accessing an emotional register that training and preparation alone could not reach. He was not trying to act brave. He was trying to understand, on some interior level, what bravery of that particular magnitude actually felt like. The digital nature of the film's construction placed unique demands on the entire cast beyond the physical. Acting convincingly against blue screen is one of the more underappreciated challenges in modern filmmaking. Without real environments, real crowds, real weather, and real visual stimuli to react to, actors must generate their emotional responses from within, relying entirely on imagination and craft to make their performances feel grounded. For Butler and his co-stars, this meant fighting invisible armies with full conviction, reacting to the death of comrades who would later be added in post-production, and delivering speeches intended to inspire thousands of men while surrounded by a small film crew in a climate-controlled warehouse. The blood that looked so viscerally real throughout the film was almost entirely added digitally after filming concluded. There were no blood packs, no elaborate practical gore effects to help actors calibrate their reactions. Every moment of apparent carnage was purely the result of performance, imagination, and digital artistry working together in post-production. One element of the film that fans rarely discuss, but which adds a fascinating texture to production story, is the improvisational quality that Snyder encouraged in certain scenes. The Oracle sequence, one of the film's most dreamlike and tonally unusual passages, was shaped significantly by improvised dialogue. Rather than strictly scripting lines intended to sound mysterious and detached from reality, Snyder gave the performer space to find a quality in the character that no written script could fully prescribe. The results contribute to the film's overall sense of inhabiting a mythological space rather than a historically reconstructed one. This was entirely deliberate on Snyder's part. His goal from the very beginning was never historical accuracy. It was mythic truth, the kind of resonance that legends carry when they've been retold so many times that they transcend documentation and become something felt rather than known. The bond that developed between the cast members during this shared ordeal became one of the most frequently cited elements when the actors later reflected on the experience. Michael Fassbender, then still in the early stages of building what would become a significant career, spoke about how the group dynamic kept him focused through the most exhausting stretches of production. Lena Headey and David Wenham both noted how the collective experience of suffering through the same training, the same heat, and the same relentless physical demands created a kind of trust between the ensemble that translated directly into their on-screen chemistry. Butler described it most vividly, saying that by the time the cast was standing together in full costume ready to shoot their first major battle sequence, they genuinely felt as though they had already been through a kind of war together. They knew each other's physical limits. They had watched each other fail and push through. That knowledge created an unspoken solidarity that no amount of cast bonding exercises organized by a studio could have manufactured. The cultural aftershock of 300 continued rippling outward long after the film left theaters. The fitness world was perhaps the arena where its influence landed most concretely. The so-called 300 workout, the specific training regimen developed by Mark Twight for the cast, became a global phenomenon. Fitness magazines published breakdowns of the routine. Personal trainers adapted it for gym classes around the world. The workout involved completing 300 repetitions across a circuit of exercises, including pull-ups, deadlifts, push-ups, box jumps, floor wipers, and kettlebell movements, all without rest between stations. The benchmark was brutal enough that, according to reports from the production, only a single cast member successfully completed the full circuit as prescribed. Butler himself later acknowledged that after filming ended, he was too physically depleted to train at all for more than a year. The body he had built to maintain through 7 months of preparation and months of shooting needed that long simply to recover. Beyond fitness, the film sparked conversations that stretched into territory its creators may not have fully anticipated. Academic interest in the historical battle of Thermopylae increased noticeably following the film's release, with book sales of ancient historical texts rising and educators finding that students who had never previously shown interest in ancient Greek history were suddenly motivated to dig deeper. Historians were quick to point out the numerous liberties the film took with the actual historical record, and those criticisms were largely valid. But even critics acknowledged that 300 accomplished something rare. It made an event from 25 centuries ago feel urgently alive and emotionally immediate to audiences worldwide. That is not a small achievement, regardless of how freely it interpreted its source material. The visual language that Snyder developed for 300 sent ripples through the film and television industry that are still visible today. The combination of high-contrast color grading, slow-motion combat photography, and graphic novel panel composition created an aesthetic template that numerous subsequent productions drew from heavily. Series and films that came after 300 borrowed its dramatic staging, its stylized blood effects, and its approach to using visual grandeur as an emotional amplifier. Snyder himself carried the aesthetic sensibility. He refined on 300 into subsequent projects, and the film is widely credited with expanding the boundaries of what studios were willing to greenlight in terms of visually adventurous, genre-bending productions. For Gerard Butler personally, the film represented a dividing line in a professional life that he could not have planned for and can never fully replicate. Before Leonidas, he was a working actor with genuine talent and a growing body of work that had not yet found a role large enough to showcase what he was capable of. After Leonidas, he was a global star with a signature performance so deeply embedded in popular culture that it followed him through every project he took on afterward. The opportunities that opened up in the wake of 300 were immediate and significant. Romantic dramas, action franchises, thrillers, comedies. Butler moved through genres with a range that surprised audiences who had only seen him as a bellowing Spartan king. He found success in projects as tonally different from each other as a tender romantic drama opposite Hilary Swank and a gritty revenge thriller exploring the moral failures of the justice system. He built a franchise around a Secret Service agent character across multiple films that performed consistently at the box office. Through all of it, the shadow of King Leonidas remained, not as a burden, but as a foundation upon which everything else was constructed. What Butler's candid reflections on the making of 300 ultimately give audiences is something genuinely valuable. A reminder that the images we absorb so effortlessly in a darkened theater are built on an invisible architecture of human effort, pain, creativity, and sacrifice. The slow-motion sequences that made 300 visually intoxicating were the product of a cast pushing their bodies to and past the point of injury in a sweltering studio surrounded by blue screens. The warrior bond that felt so emotionally convincing on screen was forged in actual shared suffering during months of preparation that left grown men barely able to function by the end. The iconic roar that turned a Scottish actor into a global symbol of cinematic defiance came from a man who had spent 7 months dismantling and rebuilding himself physically, and who was simultaneously attempting to reach some inner place where real courage actually lives. None of that shows in the finished film, and that invisibility is precisely the point. Great cinema disguises the cost of its creation completely. Gerard Butler has finally given us a glimpse of that cost, and it makes every frame of 300 richer for knowing it.